G'day everyone, my name's Oliver Samuel Jesshope and I'm reporting to you from the North Queensland Freedom Network with Mark, who's behind the camera, the legend, doing all this, independent media network stuff, and we're here with also another legend, Deborah, who runs the frog hospital that resides between Tully and Mission Beach, and she does some fantastic work with looking after all kinds of frogs, discovering new kinds of diseases and doing her best to treat them. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here with you today, Deborah, because I've heard lots about it, and you make quite an impact for the frogs here in North Queensland and perhaps even all over the country. There's not too many others like yourself with your experience. And so yeah, I'm really interested to know a little bit more about you. If you could introduce yourself to our viewers and speak a little bit about your journey.
Deborah Pergolotti, although as you could tell from the accent, I'm not from here. But I've been around the place and moved to Sydney a long time ago, then moved to Brisbane, then moved to the Daintree, then moved to Cairns, and now I live here in this lovely little spot called Mission Beach, and still deal with all the frogs from all over the place. But yeah, this is home for the time being, and it's so much nicer than Cairns. But anyway, thank you for that. I'm not sure about legend. Infamous might be a word some people might use. But I've always done environmental stuff in some capacity ever since I was a teenager. I mean, I've worked on rainforest issues and big dams, and then moved to Australia and started working on bats and birds and aviculture and all sorts of stuff. I had a full-time job and I was doing all this other stuff at night. I was working mostly with the Ku-ring-gai Bat Colony Committee in Sydney. And then I got interested in frogs in 1994 and thought I was wearing myself so thin, my health was going down the tubes, and I thought, well, I have to pick one thing. I'm not really doing anything constructive by spreading myself that thin, so let's just pick one animal. And I decided that frogs were the animal to work with because there's already a lot of people working on birds and there's already a lot of knowledge about them, and frogs were such that if you were an endangered species, maybe some of the researchers knew some basics about your biology, but we knew that chytrid fungus was wiping out frog populations around the place, and I thought, no, I think working with frogs would be where I have the most ability to contribute. And because they're such a small animal, I could actually work with them in a domestic setting. Not like if I wanted to work with rhinos, I either have to go to Africa to work with rhinos, or I could give money to somebody else and hope that they were going to do the right thing by the rhinos. But by working with frogs, they were right there. I could work with them in my own setting and learn more about them and do a little bit of field work and stuff. So I started doing frog things with the Sydney Frog and Tadpole Study Group, and then my health completely went, and I moved up to Queensland in '96 and did a few other frog things that were a little more bureaucratically oriented, and just thought, this is a talk fest. We're not achieving anything to actually conserve frog populations. We're just stuffing around. So I quit all that, and it was actually a government person who said, well, then why don't you just start your own group? Okay. So I started taking in sick and injured frogs, and that sort of mushroomed very quickly. That obviously as a pensioner it was going to be very hard to finance something like that because you need so many supplies and vet bills and all that stuff. So I actually started an incorporated group. So we're now called Frog Safe. We used to have a different name back then. But the frog hospital has certainly grown. At the moment we've got about 45 frogs in care. Calls come in every day from all over the country, people asking for help with things, because after all this time has gone by, I now have 23 years of rehab experience with these animals and being able to identify by their clinical presentations what's wrong with them. And so even veterinarians will call and ask, I've got a client that's just brought in a frog, I don't know anything about frogs. They'll send us some photos and a background history, and I'll tell them what I think is wrong with it and what they should do to treat it. So it's sort of taken on a life of its own. It's hard to do, and trying to recruit other people in other places to do it is very difficult. People sort of think, oh, I'd like to work with frogs, until they find out what is wrong with the animals and all the different problems that they've got, the immune deficiency, the cancer cases, all that stuff, and they very quickly sort of say, I don't mind shuttling them, but I don't think I want to do the carrying. So it's a tough ask. It is hard work.
What got you enthused with frogs to begin with, and how important do you think they are to the ecosystems here in Australia?
When I first got involved with frogs, I actually wasn't interested in frogs at all. So it was kind of, in fact, I resisted the idea very strongly. There was actually a researcher in New South Wales who was trying to convince me to get involved with frogs, and I was like, no. There was this other re-veg project that I really wanted to work on, and he's like, forget about that. Frogs need help. No. I want to do this reptile thing with the national parks thing, and so he finally said, look, he showed me some metamorphs of a really special species called Myxophies fasciolatus, which is the barred frog. Very ancient sort of frog species, long time to grow, very slow growing. It's a bulk of a thing in your hand. They're just amazing frogs. They're ground dweller. And there's about 5 species up and down the Queensland coast. And when I looked at these guys, I sort of thought, oh, well, that's interesting. So I tried out a little bit of some guided husbandry. I was supposed to keep stats on what I fed them and all that, so that was interesting. And then I got involved with the Sydney group and started going out on field trips and finding frogs in the field and learning a bit about them. So they sort of grew on me over time. And then by the time I was ready to move to Queensland, we had already seen the decimation from chytrid fungus, how many species it wiped out from the high altitudes. And I realized at that time that nobody knew how to rehabilitate a frog. I mean, if a frog had a broken leg, you brought it to a vet and they put it down because nobody knew anything about rehabilitation for frogs. And nobody ever cared to even try it. We need to know a lot sooner when a new disease has arrived than waiting several months until we can't find the frogs anymore, and then it takes years to try to piece together the situation. They didn't discover chytrid fungus while it was wiping out species. They discovered it years later, after it had already done the damage. So I thought that by setting up something where people were finding frogs and bringing them straight to me, if a new disease arrived, I'd know it right away, and we could start to do something about it. So that was one of the first reasons for setting it up. And then from there, it kind of mushroomed. So, the rehabilitation side of it, learning to recognize clinical presentations, and then just starting to document what actually came in the door, because chytrid fungus is not a problem up here. All the academics are working on it, the media will report on it, but chytrid fungus is not on our radar, and yet the frogs are declining at such a rate up here that obviously something else is going on, and that's what we're trying to document.
Yeah, I would imagine that, given how you've mentioned how frogs can kind of tell us a lot about these diseases out in the wild, are other organizations interested in working with you to learn about how these diseases may affect humans as well as agriculture and the environment in general?
I found it difficult to try to get through to people in the academic community. I think it's actually disappointing that we could have the sort of cases that come into us, the flesh eaters, the cancer, the extent of malformations, and yet we almost never hear from any academics at all that are interested in finding out more about this. What data do you have? Do you want to work on a project? There just doesn't seem to be any interest at all. Like if it's chytrid fungus, they line up around the block to do chytrid work, but that's just a puzzle piece. That is not the whole picture. It's nowhere near the whole picture. So it's very disappointing that we haven't had anybody contact us with any interest, and we've tried going to conferences, and I've met with the Commonwealth and state threatened species commissioners, given them handouts about the cancer cases, that we have the highest rates of amphibian cancer in the world. Never hear from these people again. So there just doesn't seem to be any interest, which is really disappointing, because these animals are telling us that something is drastically wrong in the environment. It's got to be pollution, but just because we don't see it doesn't mean the pollution isn't there. It's there and affecting a lot of wildlife. The toxicology is not even in the mainstream.
Can you explain a little bit about what toxicology is?
Just basically the investigation of toxins, and they have very specialized equipment for finding any sort of chemical or drug or even metals pollution inside the body.
What are some obstacles that you've faced and challenges that you've had to deal with that have hindered your research and progress in this field?
The sort of threats, I think, are things that have never been investigated properly. So one of the earliest ones, of course, would be aerial spraying. I mean, a lot of farms around the area use aerial spraying, and that stuff drifts. It doesn't stay exactly where you spray it, it drifts. So you're talking about microparticles of things that other animals could be picking up, especially when they drift down into the waterways. So frogs will pick it up that way. But insects are in decline. Land snails are in decline. There's birds are in decline. I mean, there's so many different things that are in decline. Is there a common reason why all these things are going at the same time, or are they all declining to different and unique circumstances? So I think that some of the areas of pollution that haven't really been not even acknowledged, much less researched, is the amount of geoengineering that goes on around the place. Thankfully, there's been less of that since the other problem came along in 2020, that we're not getting the planes coming over anymore, so they haven't been spraying. But that stuff is supposed to be deadly to insects and very bad for human health as well. There are scientific papers out there talking about how geoengineering is a threat to human health. But nobody in Australia wants to talk about geoengineering. They don't even acknowledge it exists. So right there, it's like, well, we're never going to look at that problem if you don't even acknowledge that it even exists in the first place. The other thing that also I think is understated is EMF pollution. And again, that could be very deadly towards insects as well. Once you start wiping out the insects, other things up the chain are going to go with it. So we've got things that could be happening out there in the environment that might have a very global or even a landscape scale to them, and they're not even acknowledged. They're not on the radar at all. Why are so many wildlife animals coming out with new disease problems that they've never had before? And I believe, again, if you skip the toxicology, then you're missing one of the biggest pieces of why those diseases are evolving to attack new targets, but also why are those targets suddenly more susceptible to those diseases than they ever used to be in the past. Something has changed. It's almost like a dance going around between the immune system and the pathogen. The pathogens keep evolving and getting stronger, and the immune system keeps getting assaulted and getting weaker. And eventually, you've got this widespread problem. That's whether it's chytrid fungus or beak and feather disease in the bird population, or the transmissible cancer in Tassie devils, which is a new type of cancer, an actual contagious cancer. So that's a new type of cancer that's developed in those animals. There's all these new problems that are turning up in wildlife, and until they start taking toxicology seriously, they're missing a huge piece of what's going on. So that's as far as the threat to frogs goes. As far as the threat to our ability to help the animals, we have two main issues that have been impossible to overcome. One is that we don't have enough money coming in the door because a lot of people don't care about frogs. And the other one is that it is extremely hard to get volunteers to commit to coming and helping with stuff here. We've got easy things to work on, we've got more complex things to work on, but getting people to actually show up and help with stuff has been brutally difficult. The less people we have, the more stuff falls back onto my plate. And I can tell you, I have a limit. It is tough when you just don't have enough volunteer help, because it's a very physical job. And a lot of physical tasks associated with it. A lot of people think that they could sit at home on their computer and help us remotely. Well, if you want to do marketing, yeah, you could do that. But what about all the tank washing we've got? These are physical things. You have to be here to do it. There's a very big distinct in Australia between whether you're a community organization or a scientific organization. And this is one of the reasons why we don't qualify for government funding, is because we really migrate into that scientific area of things where basically you're a community group, you're not supposed to do that. So we don't get money out of the science promotion institutions, and yet the community group institutions don't want to fund us either because, well, you're not really doing the typical community group stuff. You're too close to science, we don't fund that. So we fall between the cracks on both sides of the fence. So it's really hard. The academics only want to work with the academic institutions, and the community groups work with their things, and there's some citizen science that fits in the middle, but we don't quite fit into that very well either. So we're just very, very unique in the way all this stuff is structured. So we cross platforms, which is not encouraged, and At the same time, we don't have any academics on our committee or anything, and the academics look at that and say, well, you don't have a degree, so why should we talk to you? So we've had a bit of that thrown in our face as well. So
I also understand that you're really into books, so it sounds to me like that you'll buy the book, just not theirs. Are there any particularly endangered species of frogs that are out there that we need to be making sure that we're aware of?
We've got all these wind farms that are being rubber stamped up here in far north Queensland. While a lot of the environment community wants to have renewable energy, the problem is these wind farms are being approved for the wrong places. And we have environmental laws that are supposed to protect endangered species in particular, and they're simply not being applied. These things are being rubber stamped regardless of whatever laws we have. So with the two wind farms in particular that are on everybody's tongues at the moment, the Caban Green Hub up at Tumulin on the tablelands behind the coast here, and also the proposed Chulumbin wind farm, which is 4 times the size of Caban. The Chulumbin one basically is right on the border of World Heritage Area, and they're going to have to do a lot of clearing for all these turbines that they're going to put in. But there is an endangered frog species that only occurs in that seepage area around Ravenshoe to Moulin Millstream. So that's the whole area for this frog, and if both of these projects are going to proceed, Caban has already destroyed a lot of their habitat. They're already dynamiting. They've already done pollution within the site. And we don't know how badly the frog has been affected because nobody's allowed in. But these two projects combined are really going to knock this particular frog on the head. It's called the magnificent brood frog. Just a little thing. It's Pseudophony govesivice is its Latin name. And the Pseudophonies are cute little colorful frogs, a bit of splash of burnt red on the back, and they've got some mottling underneath. So just a tiny little frog, but it's in a very specialized habitat. It really can't handle the disturbance. And I think one of the issues there, not just for that frog, but this whole attitude in Queensland that captive breeding is not needed or wanted for any frog species in Queensland. The department has not approved anybody to do captive breeding. And if you've got a decline in progress and you don't know all the threats that are causing that decline, or you think you know the threats, but no matter what you do, you're still not slowing down that decline, it's still proceeding, you have to get a certain amount of those animals into a captive breeding situation so that at least you've got an assurance population. That is frowned upon by Queensland government, and I think that's part of the threat that every frog species that in decline in Queensland, whether it's officially acknowledged as endangered or not, it is under threat, it is in decline, and you're not allowing anybody to set up a captive breeding operation. So that's one of my other beefs with the state in Queensland, that they don't recognize the usefulness or importance of captive breeding, and therefore if you don't have the right permits, you can't do it.
Do you have any information on what laws that would usually be used to, protect these species?
The Nature Conservation Act that basically governs a lot of that stuff to do with, permits for keeping wildlife and that sort of thing. And they've got, so there's the Act and then there's the regulations for the Act. So certain things in the regulations, they can easily make changes to things without it having to go to a vote in Parliament. But if they want to change the Act, that has to go through a very detailed process and it has to be voted on in Parliament. But the Nature Conservation Act basically controls wildlife and development in Queensland. The Integrated Planning Act, unless that's been superseded by now, but that also governs a lot of development stuff. So, but they keep changing this stuff all the time. It gets very confusing. I think they do that to deliberately confuse people.
So if I understand you correctly, Deborah, the government isn't even following their own laws and regulations when it comes to environmental conservation for particular species that are endangered.
You've got the state level stuff, and then you've got the Commonwealth level stuff, which falls under the EPBC Act. So anything to do with an endangered habitat type or an endangered species, if you are a developer and you want to put up whatever it is, you want to put up a shopping mall in this particular location, if there is an endangered species there, you are supposed to put in a referral to the EPBC, and then they're supposed to look at the project and decide is this so bad that we don't even want this to go ahead and they can reject it? Or is it a controlled development or non-controlled development? Non-controlled might end up just being, well, okay, thanks for letting us know. Yeah, you can go ahead, but just make sure you do this or don't do that. So there might be some conditions put on it. But if it's a controlled one, then they could ask for an environmental impact statement, or they might have some other questions that they are concerned about. Well, we'd like to know what you're going to do about this particular species, or can you can you move the siding of your building to assist this species? They can ask whatever questions they want. But generally speaking, in recent years, in fact, actually since the LNP came to power in 2013, when Abbott came in, they have been rubber stamping everything that comes across their desk. And if it is a really bad project, they'll put some conditions on it, but the conditions are not enforced. So, perfect example is what happened with the spectacled flying fox colony in the Cairns CBD. Conditions were put, there were several referrals that were approved to destroy that colony, piece by piece. They just took down tree after tree after tree after tree, squeezed the animals in, then they started building these big hotels right around the edges of the colony, cranes going overhead, pile drivers. I mean, it was insane right through the birthing season. Now, EPBC could have controlled that situation. They could have said, well, you can build your hotel, but not during the birthing season. No, they didn't do that. They went ahead and approved all this stuff to occur, no matter how destructive it was, to a nationally significant nursery colony. This wasn't just any camp. This was one of the most important camps for the species, and EPBC allowed its destruction, even during the birthing season. And when we had evidence that those conditions were breached and gave it to the compliance unit, they said, no, they weren't breached, no problem. So they're not enforcing the conditions anyway. So here we've got an act that's basically, there's a bit of lip service to make it look as if they're still enforcing the act, but they're not enforcing anything. They're not enforcing the conditions that they put on these developments, and they're not rejecting anything when they're really bad. So the law is not being used to uphold a status for endangered species that are being affected by development. And then you've got the state laws as well. So with the wind farms in particular, my understanding is that the state was actually told, no, we don't need you as a referral agency on this. You have no opportunity to comment at all. Now that's just ridiculous. DES would be a standard referral agency for any kind of environmental impact on a development in this state, and they were simply told, no, we don't need you for this. So why did the Commonwealth do that? How come you decided to bypass the state as a referral agency for a development of this scale that's going to probably wipe out the frog species, but also affect other endangered species that are there as well? So the laws are just being ignored, and now you've got the Morrison government, which has tried twice now to completely sidestep the EPBC and hand over total power for approvals to the state governments. So I think the second time he did it, it did pass the House. The first time it passed the House and was defeated in the Senate by maybe only one vote. He made an amendment to it, put it through the House again, it passed. Now it's sitting with the Senate. And I think before December, I think they just didn't get around to voting on that particular bill. But if it passes the Senate this time, that's it. There will be no EPBC left. They will simply go right around it and just hand everything over to the states. The laws are written, but they're not worth the paper they're printed on because they're just being ignored.
And it would appear that perhaps with this wind farm development threatening the frog species could set a really dangerous precedent for not only the frogs but also all wildlife species in Australia. Is this correct?
Yes, it could, because once they get away with the fact that they can ignore anything they want and do whatever they want, then why do they ever have to adhere to the law again in the future? They could just, each time they push the envelope and go further and further, if they get away with it, then they'll push further next time and further the next time. So it's sort of simple. Well, we have an election coming up. Get them out. That's it. They got to go. And start getting in some more third parties. And as soon as you take that balance of power away from the major parties, you get a lot more discussion. They can't just ram through legislation like the this latest government has done. You look at some of those surveillance laws that have come in, like, whoa, this is not North Korea. So, that's the sort of thing you get if you've got a dominant government that holds all the cards. If you start getting a mixture of independents and third parties mixed in there, then you start having debate, you start having discussions, you start having negotiations about what is acceptable or not acceptable. You start getting laws that actually favor the people. So I hope that people will really wisen up in this next election, both the states and the federal, that, don't you think we've had enough of these people? It's time to give somebody else a chance.
I'm really interested to ask what you would do with $1 million if you had $1 million, or if you were the Prime Minister. I like to ask people, what would be maybe 3 things that you'd do? But let's talk in the context of your frog hospital.
The first one, I think, is that we really have to go with paid staff. I cannot do 20 people's work, and we just can't get the volunteers to do it. It's so hard, and they're not here to help the group succeed. They're here for whatever their own personal purposes are. I would love to be able to hire our own microbiologist. We've got somebody in mind who could work on a lot of these frog things that are turning up, these cases that we've had, the cancer and all this other stuff. He's not a toxicologist, the guy I've got in mind, but he could still do a lot of work on trying to pinpoint what is going on with these animals, why isn't their immune system working. We've had some weird anomalies show up in the animals that have never been investigated. So we would love to hire our own microbiologists. Would probably cost us about $175,000 a year plus lab fees for, say, 3 years to work on a project to basically uncover a lot of what's going on with the frogs. So that would be nice. It would be great to have a really good size acreage property where we can really concentrate on habitat restoration and especially breeding. Now, government doesn't like it when we talk captive breeding. Yeah, fine. But we can still do in situ breeding if we've got the right environment, the right clean environment. So, and being able to have an interpretive center where the public can actually come in and get information and education, and paid staff to assist them. So yes, having a purpose-built facility would be nice. I mean, those are a little more far-fetched and require the sort of money we probably never will have. But what would be nice in the short term is that we really need new plastic enclosures for these animals, and we can't afford them. So that would be nice if we even had enough money come in to buy, 100 nice new nifty plastic enclosures to put the frogs in. And it would still be nice if we can get a toxicology project going too. We really have to. If the government doesn't want to do it, we just have to do it ourselves.
Yeah, if people want to, perhaps people that do have $1 million, how could they maybe reach out to you? Do you have a website? Are you on social media?
We do have a huge website, and there's information in there, like for different people. Like some people want to donate with credit cards, some people want to use cash. We're happy about cash. We like cash. We do have a MeWe page, which is the opposite of Facebook. So we do have a MeWe page, Frog Hospital. We do have a supporters page that's not exactly ours, but it's on Facebook. So it's just called Frog Hospital Supporters. So people can sort of get to us through that, and we can sort of put out messages through that. And we have a telephone. People can call us up.
Yeah.
So
thank you so much for your time, Deborah. It's been really awesome learning all about frogs and toxicology, how we can tell a lot about frogs and their relationship with the environment and our relationship to the environment, as well as that really important issue that you brought up with the laws that pertain to protecting all, not just frogs, but all wildlife here in Australia. So thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. My name's Oliver Samuel Jesshope. Our legend cameraman is Mark. And that will be all for today. Thank you so much, Deborah.
Well, thanks very much for your interest. It was good to talk to you.